They called it the happy time, a period when German submarines prowled the Atlantic like wolves among sheep, sending Allied vessels to the ocean floor with terrifying efficiency. Between 1939 and 1945, over 3,500 merchant ships and 175 warships were sent to watery graves by Germany's U-boat fleet, claiming the lives of more than 72,000 Allied sailors and threatening to starve Britain into submission. This was the Battle of the Atlantic, the longest continuous military campaign of World War II, and it came closer to deciding the war's outcome than any other theater of combat. Winston Churchill himself would later write that the U-boat peril was the only thing that ever really frightened him during the entire war. Today, we dive beneath the surface to explore the revolutionary tactics, innovative technology, and ruthless determination that made Germany's underwater warriors the most feared naval force of their time. When war erupted in September 1939, Germany's Kriegsmarine found itself in a precarious position. The surface fleet was hopelessly outnumbered by the Royal Navy, with Britain possessing over 15 battleships and battlecruisers compared to Germany's handful of capital ships. But Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat force, understood that Germany possessed a weapon that could neutralize Britain's numerical advantage, the Unterseeboot, or U-boat. Dönitz had served aboard submarines during the First World War and witnessed firsthand their devastating potential. He believed that underwater warfare, if prosecuted with sufficient numbers and proper tactics, could sever Britain's maritime lifelines and force the island nation to its knees. Britain imported over 60 million tons of supplies annually, including half of its food and virtually all of its oil. If these convoys could be systematically destroyed, Britain would face starvation and industrial collapse long before American intervention could turn the tide. The tactical doctrine that would nearly accomplish this ambitious goal was born from Dönitz's experiences and innovations. Traditional submarine warfare of the First World War had relied on lone U-boats operating independently, attacking submerged during daylight hours using periscopes and torpedoes. This approach was limited by the primitive technology of the era. Slow underwater speeds, limited battery life, and crude targeting systems meant that opportunities for attack were rare and success rates disappointing. Dönitz recognized that submarines of the new generation possessed capabilities that previous models lacked. The Type 7 U-boat, which would become the workhorse of Germany's underwater fleet, could achieve 17 knots on the surface, faster than most merchant ships and comparable to many convoy escorts. More importantly, Dönitz realized that a U-boat was not truly a submarine in the modern sense, but rather a submersible torpedo boat. It operated most effectively on the surface, diving only to escape detection or attack. This fundamental insight would revolutionize submarine warfare. From this understanding, Dönitz developed the tactic that would terrorize Allied convoys for years, the Rudeltaktik, known to the Allies as the Wolf Pack. Rather than operating alone, U-boats would coordinate their attacks in groups, overwhelming convoy defenses through sheer numbers and synchronized assault. The concept was elegantly simple but devastatingly effective. A single U-boat, acting as a scout, would locate an Allied convoy and shadow it while maintaining radio silence to avoid detection. Once positioned, the scout would break radio silence to transmit the convoy's position, course, and speed to U-boat headquarters in occupied France. Dönitz's operations staff would then vector additional submarines toward the target, assembling a wolf pack of anywhere from 8 to 20 U-boats around the unsuspecting convoy. The attack would commence at night, with U-boats approaching on the surface under cover of darkness. Surface attacks offered multiple advantages. The U-boat's low silhouette made it nearly invisible against the dark ocean. Its diesel engines provided unlimited range and high speed for maneuvering. And most critically, the primitive sonar systems of the era could not detect surface vessels. The U-boats would penetrate the convoy's protective screen, infiltrating between columns of merchant ships like wolves among a flock of sheep, firing torpedoes at point-blank range before racing away on the surface to reload and attack again. The psychological impact of wolf pack attacks cannot be overstated. Imagine the terror of a merchant sailor aboard a slow-moving freighter in the middle of the Atlantic on a moonless night. Without warning, a torpedo slams into a ship 300 yards away, the explosion lighting up the darkness as the vessel begins to sink. Minutes later, another ship erupts in flames, then another. Escort vessels race around firing star shells and depth charges, but the attackers remain invisible, striking from the darkness with impunity. Lifeboats are lowered into frigid waters as men abandon sinking ships, knowing that rescue might never come. Some convoys lost 10, 15, even 20 ships in a single night to coordinated wolfpack assaults. The survivors who made it to lifeboats faced exposure, hypothermia, and dehydration in the cruel Atlantic waters. Many died slowly over days or weeks, drifting in the empty ocean, while others perished in minutes as fuel oil from ruptured tanks ignited around them, turning the sea itself into an inferno. The period from June 1940 to February 1941 became known among U-boat crews as the Die glückliche Zeit, the happy time. Following France's surrender, Germany acquired bases along the French Atlantic coast, dramatically reducing the transit time for U-boats traveling to and from their hunting grounds. Bases at Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, Brest, La Rochelle, and Bordeaux became bustling submarine ports, complete with massive reinforced concrete bunkers called U-boat pens that protected the submarines from Allied air attacks. These strategic positions allowed U-boats to spend more time on patrol and less time in transit, effectively multiplying Germany's submarine strength. During this period, the U-boat force achieved staggering success rates. In October 1940 alone, U-boats sank 63 Allied ships, totaling over 350,000 tons. Individual U-boat commanders became celebrated aces, their exploits broadcast throughout Germany as propaganda victories. Commanders like Günther Prien, who had infiltrated the supposedly impregnable British naval base at Scapa Flow and sunk the battleship Royal Oak, became national heroes. Otto Kretschmer, the most successful U-boat ace of all time, perfected the technique of surface night attacks, sinking 47 merchant ships and destroying over 270,000 tons of Allied shipping before his capture in March 1941. Joachim Schepke and Engelbert Endras joined this elite group of aces, their success inspiring new recruits and striking fear into Allied naval planners. The tactical innovations extended beyond wolfpack coordination. U-boat commanders developed sophisticated methods for approaching and attacking convoys that maximized their chances of success while minimizing risk. The stern chase involved pursuing a convoy from behind, allowing the U-boat to match the convoy's speed while remaining outside the range of rear escorts. When darkness fell, the U-boat would accelerate on the surface, overtaking the convoy and positioning itself ahead of the formation. As the convoy steamed forward, the U-boat would lie in wait, allowing targets to approach rather than pursuing them. This ahead ambush tactic gave U-boat commanders the luxury of selecting their targets carefully, prioritizing tankers and ammunition ships whose destruction would have maximum impact. Another technique, called inside the formation, was perhaps the most audacious. U-boats would surface in the middle of the night and drive directly into the convoy formation itself, navigating between columns of merchant ships in the darkness. From these interior positions, commanders could fire torpedoes in multiple directions, hitting several ships before the escorts even realized an attacker had penetrated their defensive screen. The technology aboard U-boats evolved to support these tactics. Although the basic Type 7 design remained unchanged throughout most of the war, incremental improvements enhanced their combat effectiveness. The introduction of electric torpedoes eliminated the telltale bubble trail of compressed air torpedoes, making it nearly impossible for victims to determine the direction of attack. Acoustic homing torpedoes, designated T5 or Soundkünning, could lock onto the propeller noise of escort vessels, finally giving U-boats an effective weapon against their tormentors. Improved diesel engines increased surface speed and range, while enhanced battery systems extended underwater endurance. Perhaps most significantly, the schnorkel, A Dutch invention captured when Germany overran the Netherlands allowed U-boats to run their diesel engines while remaining at periscope depth, drawing in air and expelling exhaust through a retractable mast. This technology meant submarines could recharge their batteries without surfacing, dramatically reducing their vulnerability to air attack. Communication systems became increasingly sophisticated as the war progressed. The success of Wolfpack tactics depended entirely on effective coordination between widely dispersed submarines and shore-based command centers. Germany employed the Enigma machine to encode radio messages, believing their communications were absolutely secure from Allied interception and decryption. U-boat commanders received daily updates on convoy positions, routing changes, and operational orders via encrypted radio transmissions. They reported sightings, attack results, and fuel status back to headquarters, allowing Dönitz to orchestrate submarine deployments with extraordinary precision. The system worked brilliantly until Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park in Britain achieved the impossible. They cracked Enigma. This intelligence breakthrough, codenamed Ultra, would eventually prove decisive in the Battle of the Atlantic, though the Germans never discovered the compromise. Initially, Allied leaders were cautious about exploiting ultra-intelligence, fearing that too obviously acting on decrypted information would alert Germany that their codes were compromised. But as the war progressed and shipping losses mounted to catastrophic levels, ultra-intercepts were increasingly used to route convoys away from waiting wolf packs, saving countless ships and lives. The second happy time, also called the American shooting season, commenced in January 1942 following America's entry into the war. Operation Paukenschlag, or Drumbeat, sent a handful of U-boats to the American East Coast, where they found conditions almost incomprehensibly favorable. American coastal cities remained fully lit at night, silhouetting merchant ships against the glow. The U.S. Navy had failed to implement convoy systems despite Britain's repeated warnings, and merchant vessels sailed independently along predictable routes. There were almost no effective anti-submarine patrols, and the few escorts available were poorly trained in anti-submarine warfare. The results were catastrophic. In the first 6 months of 1942, U-boats sank over 600 Allied ships in American waters, many within sight of the shore. Witnesses on beaches watched ships burn on the horizon, and bodies and debris washed up along the coast. U-boat commanders called it a second happy time, finding the hunting so easy that it almost lacked sport. Hardegen, Top, and other commanders achieved stunning successes during this period, with some U-boats sinking a dozen or more during single patrols. Admiral Dönitz later commented that he wished he had sent every available U-boat to American waters to exploit this unexpected opportunity. Yet, even as U-boats achieved unprecedented success rates, the seeds of their eventual defeat were being sown. The Allied response to the U-boat threat evolved on multiple fronts simultaneously. The convoy system, which had proven effective in the First World War, was finally implemented comprehensively by late 1942, even in American waters. Merchant ships no longer sailed alone, but traveled in large formations protected by escort groups. These escorts were increasingly equipped with advanced detection equipment, including improved sonar and high-frequency direction finding, or HFDUF, that could locate U-boats by triangulating their radio transmissions. The introduction of escort carriers, small aircraft carriers converted from merchant hulls, closed the air gap in the mid-Atlantic, where land-based aircraft could not reach. Long-range patrol aircraft like the Liberator bomber were equipped with powerful searchlights, radar, and depth charges, transforming vast expanses of ocean into hunting grounds where U-boats were the prey. The development of the Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar, which fired a pattern of small projectiles ahead of the escort vessel, proved far more effective than traditional depth charges that had to be dropped over the target's last known position. The critical turning point came in May 1943, a month that would become known as Black May among U-boat crews. During this single month, 41 U-boats were sunk, almost a quarter of the operational fleet. The combination of improved Allied tactics, better equipment, air cover, ultra-intelligence and increased numbers of escorts had finally shifted the balance decisively against the submarines. Several convoy battles during this period demonstrated the changed conditions. Convoy ONS-5, which sailed from Britain to North America in late April, was attacked by a massive wolf pack of over 30 U-boats. Despite overwhelming U-boat numbers, the convoy's escort group, strengthened by additional support vessels and aided by poor weather that hindered U-boat attacks, managed to sink 6 U-boats while losing only 13 merchant ships from a convoy of 40. This exchange rate was unsustainable for Germany. Convoy CC-130, which crossed the Atlantic in May, beat off attacks by 33 U-boats without losing a single merchant ship, while the escorts sank 3 submarines. Dönitz recognized that his tactics were no longer viable, and on May 24, 1943, he took the extraordinary step of withdrawing U-boats from the North Atlantic, conceding temporary defeat in the battle's most critical theater. The psychological toll on U-boat crews during this period was immense. Early in the war, U-boat service had seemed almost glamorous. Successful commanders were lionized as heroes, crews enjoyed privileges and extra rations, and survival rates were relatively favorable. But by 1943, the reality of submarine warfare had become a nightmare. U-boats were no longer hunters, but hunted, constantly under threat from air patrols and escort groups equipped with increasingly effective detection equipment. The cramped, fetid conditions inside a submerged U-boat tested human endurance to its limits. Crews of 40 to 50 men lived for weeks or months in a steel tube barely wider than a railway car, sharing a handful of toilet facilities, sleeping in shifts and damp bunks, breathing air that grew progressively fouler with each hour submerged. The stench of unwashed bodies, diesel oil, and mildew became so pervasive that crews couldn't smell it anymore, though it would cling to them for days after returning to port. Fresh food lasted only a few days. After that, the diet consisted of preserved meats, canned vegetables, and hard bread. Condensation dripped constantly from the hull, making everything perpetually damp. And overriding all physical discomforts was the constant fear, the knowledge that if the boat were hit, there was almost no chance of survival. 3/4 of all men who served in U-boats died during the war, the highest casualty rate of any service branch in any nation. Of the approximately 40,000 men who served in U-boats, over 30,000 never returned. Despite the devastating losses of 1943, Germany continued producing U-boats at an accelerating rate. New boats left the shipyards faster than they were being sunk, but crew quality declined as experienced commanders were killed and replaced by inadequately trained officers. Dönitz desperately sought technological solutions to restore his submarine's advantage. The most promising development was the revolutionary Type 21 U-boat, a design so advanced that it influenced submarine construction for decades after the war. The Type 21 featured a streamlined hull optimized for underwater speed rather than surface performance, could achieve 17 knots submerged, faster than most escort vessels, and carried sufficient battery capacity to maintain high underwater speeds for over an hour. It was equipped with improved sonar, hydraulic torpedo loading systems that could reload all 6 bow tubes in just 12 minutes, and a sophisticated snorkel system. Had these boats entered service in significant numbers in 1943 or early 1944, they might have restored Germany's advantage in the Battle of the Atlantic. But production delays, Allied bombing of manufacturing facilities, and teething problems with new technology meant that Type 21 submarines only began appearing in very small numbers in the war's final weeks, far too late to influence the outcome. The human dimension of the U-boat war encompasses both remarkable courage and terrible tragedy. Young men, many barely 20 years old, volunteered for submarine service knowing the odds were against survival. They did so from various motivations: patriotism, adventure, pride in belonging to an elite service, or simply because they were conscripted and assigned to submarines.
Life aboard a U-boat created intense bonds between crew members who depended absolutely on one another for survival. A single mistake by any crew member could doom the entire boat. The commander who miscalculated an attack approach, the engineer who misread a gauge, the hydrophone operator who failed to detect an approaching destroyer, any of these errors could result in death for all 50 men aboard. This mutual dependence created extraordinarily tight-knit crews who thought of themselves as brothers. Many U-boat veterans who survived the war spoke of their comrades with profound emotion decades later, remembering the friends who never came home with a grief that time could not diminish. The final year of the war saw U-boats relegated to increasingly desperate missions with little hope of success. By 1945, Allied control of the Atlantic was absolute. Submarine patrols became suicide missions, with boats being sunk within days or even hours of departing port. Yet the boats continued sailing, crews continued volunteering or being ordered aboard, and men continued dying in service of a lost cause. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Dönitz, who had succeeded Hitler as head of state in the final days of the war, ordered all U-boats to surface, fly black flags of surrender, and proceed to designated ports for internment. Some commanders obeyed, others scuttled their boats rather than surrender them to the enemy. The surviving U-boats were divided among the Allied powers or used for target practice and sent to the bottom. The era of the U-boat, that weapon which had nearly changed the course of history, came to an end. The Battle of the Atlantic was won by the Allies, but it was a desperately close thing. Germany began the war with only 57 U-boats and never had more than about 100 operational boats at sea at any given time. Yet this relatively small force came within a hair's breadth of severing Britain's lifelines and potentially forcing a negotiated peace before American industrial might could tip the balance. The tactics developed by Dönitz and his commanders, wolf-pack coordination, night surface attacks, aggressive penetration of convoy formations, were revolutionary adaptations that exploited the U-boat's capabilities and the limitations of Allied defenses. Had Germany possessed adequate numbers of submarines in 1939, or had the Type 21 entered service 18 months earlier, the outcome might have been dramatically different. As it was, the underwater warriors of Germany's U-boat force demonstrated that tactical innovation and individual courage could multiply the effectiveness of limited resources, creating a threat disproportionate to their actual numbers. Their legacy extends beyond the immediate war. The tactics, technologies, and lessons learned in the Battle of the Atlantic shaped naval warfare throughout the Cold War and continue influencing submarine operations today. The men who fought beneath the Atlantic waves on both sides of the conflict earned their place in history through courage, sacrifice, and determination in one of the war's longest and most crucial campaigns.
The strategic implications of the U-boat campaign extended far beyond simple tonnage statistics, though those numbers themselves tell a sobering story. By 1943, the mathematics of merchant shipping had become a race against time that would determine the war's outcome. Britain required approximately 1 million tons of imports per month to maintain both its civilian population and military operations. Germany needed to sink ships faster than the Allies could build them, while simultaneously destroying more cargo than could be replaced through increased production and rationing. For a period spanning nearly 3 years, this equation tipped precariously in Germany's favor. In 1942 alone, U-boats sank over 1,600 Allied vessels, totaling more than 8 million tons, a rate of destruction that exceeded Allied shipbuilding capacity by a significant margin. American shipyards were performing miracles of production, launching Liberty ships in as little as 42 days from keel laying to launch. But even this unprecedented industrial achievement struggled to keep pace with the losses. Every ship sent to the bottom represented not just the vessel itself, but its cargo, tanks that would never reach the battlefield, aircraft that would never fly combat missions, fuel that would never power Allied advances, and food that would never feed civilians or soldiers. The geographic scope of the U-boat campaign was truly global, extending far beyond the famous North Atlantic convoy routes.
German submarines operated in the Arctic Ocean, attacking the perilous Murmansk convoys that carried Allied aid to the Soviet Union through some of the most hostile waters on Earth. In the Mediterranean, U-boats hunted Allied shipping supporting operations in North Africa and Italy, threading through the narrow straits and shallow waters where the risk of detection was immensely higher than in the open Atlantic. Perhaps most audacious were the long-range operations in the Indian Ocean and even the Pacific, where German U-boats operated from Japanese bases after voyages spanning 3 months and covering 20,000 miles. These distant deployments achieved limited tactical success but served important strategic purposes, forcing the Allies to dedicate anti-submarine resources across multiple theaters, creating uncertainty about where U-boats might appear next, and maintaining psychological pressure on Allied naval planners who could never be certain that any shipping lane was truly safe. The technological arms race between U-boats and Allied anti-submarine forces accelerated dramatically as both sides desperately sought advantages that might prove decisive. Germany invested enormous resources in advanced weapon systems designed to restore the U-boat's lethality. The T-11 acoustic torpedo, an improvement on the earlier T-5, featured sophisticated guidance systems that could distinguish between different types of propeller signatures, theoretically allowing it to ignore decoy noisemakers and home in on actual targets. The Lute torpedo incorporated a programmable guidance system that could execute complex search patterns, making it effective against evasive targets. Most ambitious was the development of the V8 hydrogen peroxide-powered Walter turbine, a closed-cycle propulsion system that would allow submarines to achieve unprecedented underwater speeds of 25 knots or more without needing to surface or snorkel. Had this technology matured before war's end, it would have rendered existing Allied anti-submarine tactics nearly obsolete, as no surface escort could have kept pace with such fast underwater vessels. On the defensive side, U-boats received increasingly sophisticated equipment designed to detect and evade Allied hunters. The Maycox radar detector, introduced in 1942, could warn U-boats when British aircraft were approaching by detecting their search radar emissions, allowing submarines to dive before being spotted visually. When the Allies switched to centimetric radar that Maycox couldn't detect, Germany responded with the Naxos detector calibrated to the new frequencies. Bold hydrophone arrays provided passive sonar capability, allowing U-boats to detect approaching escorts while remaining silent themselves. The Aphrodite decoy, a bubble-generating device released from a submerged U-boat, created a false sonar return that could draw depth charge attacks away from the actual submarine. As Allied acoustic torpedoes threatened U-boats, Germany developed the Sieglinde decoy, a noisemaker towed behind the submarine that would attract homing torpedoes away from the boat itself. This continuous cycle of measure and countermeasure characterized the technological dimension of the Battle of the Atlantic, with each innovation quickly spawning a response that negated its advantage. The intelligence war proved as crucial as any technological development, and it was here that Germany suffered its most consequential defeats. The breaking of the Enigma code by British cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park, aided by captured Enigma machines and code books from U-boats and surface vessels, provided the Allies with insights into German planning that proved invaluable. Beyond simply reading U-boat communications, ultra-intelligence revealed the strategic thinking at U-boat headquarters, allowing Allied planners to anticipate where wolf packs would form and what tactics they would employ. The intelligence windfall from Enigma was carefully rationed. Convoys would be routed around known U-boat positions, but not so consistently that German commanders would suspect their communications were compromised. Occasionally, convoys would be deliberately routed into danger zones when Ultra revealed only weak U-boat presence, maintaining the illusion that Allied routing decisions were based on random chance or imperfect intelligence rather than complete knowledge of German dispositions. This delicate dance of exploitation and deception demonstrated the sophistication of Allied intelligence operations and the pivotal role that information warfare played in modern combat.
Germany was not entirely blind to Allied capabilities, and its own intelligence services achieved significant successes that prolonged the U-boat threat. The B-Dienst, Germany's naval cryptanalysis service, successfully broke British Naval Cipher No. 3, which was used for convoy communications, giving U-boat command advanced knowledge of convoy routes, speeds, and composition during critical periods in 1942 and early 1943. This breakthrough partially offset Allied advantages and contributed to the devastating losses suffered during that period. German aerial reconnaissance, conducted by long-range Focke-Wulf Condor aircraft operating from French bases, provided real-time intelligence on convoy movements, until Allied fighters and improved shipboard anti-aircraft defenses made such missions prohibitively dangerous. Spain, though officially neutral, provided intelligence to Germany about Allied ship movements through Gibraltar, while a network of agents in neutral ports reported on convoy departures and destinations. The intelligence picture was never entirely one-sided, though by war's end, Allied superiority in this domain had become overwhelming. The human stories emerging from the Battle of the Atlantic encompass extraordinary examples of endurance, survival against impossible odds, and the random cruelty of maritime warfare. Merchant seamen who survived one sinking often went back to sea, knowing the odds of surviving a second attack were slim, because the convoys had to sail and someone had to crew the ships. Some men survived multiple sinkings, each time enduring hours or days in lifeboats or clinging to wreckage in frigid waters before rescue, bearing psychological scars that would haunt them for life. Others died on their first voyage, buried in unmarked ocean graves before they had truly begun their service. The story of SS Anglo-Saxon, torpedoed in August 1940, illustrates the horrific possibilities of survival at sea. 7 men escaped in a small jollyboat with minimal provisions and no navigation equipment. They drifted for 70 days across 2,700 miles of open ocean, as one by one, men died from exposure, dehydration, and starvation. Only 2 men ultimately reached land in the Bahamas, both barely alive and permanently damaged by their ordeal. Such stories multiplied across thousands of attacks, each representing individual tragedies that statistical summaries cannot adequately convey. U-boat crews faced their own particular horrors when their boats were destroyed. Unlike surface ships, submarines offered almost no possibility of escape once severely damaged. A U-boat attacked by aircraft while surfaced might be torn apart by bombs or rockets, killing the crew instantly or leaving survivors swimming in burning oil slicks. Boats caught by escort groups and subjected to depth charging faced a prolonged nightmare of terror as explosions bracketed the hull, each detonation bringing the submarine's structure closer to catastrophic failure. The pressure hull might spring leaks, allowing seawater to spray into compartments with cutting force, or worse, it might rupture entirely, causing the boat to implode as it plunged past its crushed depth. Some U-boat crews had time to recognize their fate as their boat lost control and plummeted toward the ocean floor, the hull groaning and buckling under increasing pressure until it finally gave way. A handful of U-boat men survived their boat sinking and made it to the surface, only to face exposure, drowning, or, on rare occasions, rescue by Allied vessels who would take them prisoner. The U-boat service maintained the fiction that their casualty rates were acceptable and that new technologies would restore their advantage, but experienced commanders and crew members knew the truth. By 1944, sailing on a U-boat had become a death sentence that most would not escape. The ethical dimensions of submarine warfare troubled some participants even during the conflict and would continue generating controversy for decades afterward. The Laconia incident of September 1942 exemplified these moral complexities in stark terms. U-156, commanded by Korvettenkapitän Werner Hartenstein, torpedoed the British troopship Laconia in the South Atlantic, not knowing the ship carried nearly 1,800 Italian prisoners of war, in addition to British military personnel and civilians. When Hartenstein surfaced and discovered Italian POWs drowning among the survivors, he immediately began rescue operations, broadcasting in clear language his position and intent, flying Red Cross flags and calling for assistance from all nations. Multiple U-boats and Vichy French warships converged on the scene to assist with rescue efforts, with U-boats taking survivors aboard and towing lifeboats despite their own vulnerability to attack. Then, an American B-24 Liberator bomber, either ignorant of or indifferent to the rescue operation, attacked the U-boats, forcing them to dive and abandon hundreds of survivors still in the water. The incident prompted Admiral Donitz to issue the controversial Laconia Order, directing U-boat commanders to cease all rescue operations for survivors of ships they had sunk, arguing that humanitarian instincts endangered submarines and their crews. This order would later feature prominently in Donitz's war crimes trial at Nuremberg, though he was ultimately acquitted on this specific charge. The ethical dimensions of submarine warfare extended beyond the Laconia Order. Several U-boat commanders were accused of machine gunning survivors in lifeboats or deliberately ramming lifeboats to prevent survivors from reporting the U-boat's position. Most such allegations were never substantiated, and many U-boat commanders vehemently rejected the notion that such actions were commonplace or condoned. Heinz Wilhelm Eck, commander of U-852, was tried and executed after the war for ordering his crew to fire upon survivors of the Greek steamer Peleus, attempting to eliminate witnesses who might report his boat's position, one of the few proven cases of such actions. The vast majority of U-boat attacks followed the established rules of submarine warfare as they had evolved through international convention, though those rules themselves were often honored more in the breach than the observance by all participants. The line between legitimate military necessity and war crimes in the context of submarine warfare remained blurred, with each side accusing the other of violations while engaging in morally questionable practices themselves.
The final months of the war saw U-boat operations descend into futility and desperation as Allied supremacy became absolute and German defeat inevitable. New U-boats continued entering service, but they ventured into a hostile ocean where their survival could be measured in days rather than weeks. Allied air patrols blanketed European coastal waters, making it almost impossible for U-boats to transit from their bases to open ocean without detection. The introduction of acoustic homing torpedoes by Allied forces meant that U-boats faced threats from weapons that could pursue them relentlessly once fired. Escort groups had perfected coordinated search patterns that left U-boats few options for escape once detected. Most devastating was the simple reality that by 1945, Germany controlled no territory worth defending and no shipping lanes worth attacking. The strategic rationale for the U-boat campaign had evaporated along with Germany's hopes for victory. Yet the boats continued sailing and men continued dying, primarily because Dönitz refused to admit defeat and because Hitler's regime would tolerate no suggestion of surrender. The ideological dimension of the U-boat service deserves examination, uncomfortable though it may be. While individual U-boat crew members joined for various reasons unrelated to Nazi ideology, professional military service, adventure, economic necessity, or simple conscription, the U-boat arm as an institution became increasingly intertwined with National Socialist values as the war progressed. Dönitz himself was a convinced Nazi who maintained loyalty to Hitler until the dictator's suicide, and he ensured that Nazi political officers had influence within the submarine service. Motivational materials distributed to U-boat crews emphasized ideological themes of racial struggle, characterizing the battle as defending European civilization against Jewish and Bolshevik enemies. Some U-boat commanders were committed Nazis who saw their service in explicitly ideological terms, while others were apolitical professionals focused solely on military duty. And still others harbored private doubts about the regime they served but felt bound by oaths and military discipline. The U-boat service was not monolithic in its political character, but neither was it simply a collection of individuals pursuing military objectives divorced from the larger evil of the Nazi regime. The economic impact of the U-boat campaign on Britain came terrifyingly close to achieving its intended effect. By early 1943, British food reserves had dwindled to less than 2 months' supply, and fuel stocks approached crisis levels. Rationing had been implemented for virtually all commodities, with civilians subsisting on monotonous diets of bread, potatoes, and whatever vegetables could be grown domestically. The famous Dig for Victory campaign, encouraging British citizens to convert every available plot of land into vegetable gardens, was born from genuine desperation rather than mere propaganda. Industrial production faced constraints from material shortages, with factories unable to operate at full capacity due to lack of raw materials that had to be imported across U-boat-infested waters. The construction of synthetic oil plants and intensive exploitation of British coal fields partially offset petroleum shortages but never eliminated dependence on seaborne imports. Churchill's statement that the U-boat peril frightened him more than anything else reflected this stark reality. Britain could survive the Blitz, could rebuild after bombing raids, could endure setbacks in land campaigns, but it could not survive complete severance of its maritime supply lines. For 3 years, the margin between adequacy and catastrophe measured in mere weeks of available supplies, with every convoy battle potentially tipping the balance toward starvation and surrender. The coordination between U-boats and other elements of German military power amplified the submarine threat's effectiveness. The Luftwaffe's long-range reconnaissance aircraft, particularly the Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor, provided vital intelligence on convoy movements during the early war years, allowing U-boat command to vector wolfpacks toward lucrative targets with precision. When these aircraft carried bombs, they added their own contribution to shipping losses, sometimes attacking convoys that U-boats would subsequently ambush after darkness fell. German surface raiders, disguised merchant vessels armed with concealed weapons, operated in distant waters where U-boats were scarce, forcing the Allies to dedicate escort resources across global trade routes rather than concentrating them on the critical North Atlantic run. Warships like the battleship Tirpitz, though rarely venturing from Norwegian fjords, tied down substantial British naval forces that had to remain prepared to counter any sortie, forces that could otherwise have strengthened convoy escorts. Mines laid by aircraft, submarines, and surface vessels around British ports and in major shipping channels destroyed hundreds of vessels and delayed countless more, compounding the shipping shortage. This multi-layered maritime warfare strategy, with U-boats as its deadliest element, represented a sophisticated approach to severing Britain's oceanic lifelines through coordinated pressure applied across multiple dimensions. The development of countermeasures evolved through painful trial and error, with early approaches proving woefully inadequate against determined wolfpack attacks. Initial convoy escort groups were too small, too poorly equipped, and too inadequately trained to protect their charges effectively. Destroyers and corvettes lacked sufficient speed to chase down surfaced U-boats while simultaneously protecting slow-moving merchant ships. Early depth charges had to be dropped directly over a submarine's estimated position, requiring the attacking vessel to lose sonar contact at the critical moment of attack, a fundamental flaw that U-boats exploited by changing depth and direction as soon as an attacker passed overhead. The introduction of the Hedgehog mortar system represented a revolutionary improvement, firing a pattern of contact-fused projectiles ahead of the escort vessel, allowing the attacker to maintain sonar contact throughout the attack and requiring only one hit to destroy a submarine rather than a near miss with a depth charge. Support groups, specialized anti-submarine formations that operated independently from convoys, responding to U-boat contacts and hunting submarines in their operating areas, transformed defensive convoy protection into aggressive anti-submarine warfare. The creation of these support groups became possible only when sufficient escort vessels existed to both protect convoys adequately and form independent hunter-killer groups.
Aircraft emerged as perhaps the single most decisive factor in defeating the U-boat threat, closing the air gap in the mid-Atlantic where land-based planes from Britain and North America couldn't reach. The introduction of escort carriers, small aircraft carriers converted from merchant vessels or built specifically for convoy escort, finally provided air cover throughout the entire Atlantic crossing. These ships carried a handful of fighters and anti-submarine aircraft that could patrol around convoys, forcing U-boats to remain submerged, where their slow underwater speed prevented them from keeping pace with surface ships. Very long-range aircraft like the B-24 Liberator, when equipped with additional fuel tanks and anti-submarine weapons, could patrol deep into the central Atlantic, further reducing areas where U-boats could operate with impunity. Coastal Command's aggressive patrols over U-boat transit routes near European bases inflicted heavy losses on submarines attempting to reach or return from operational areas. The development of airborne radar that U-boats couldn't detect meant aircraft could locate surfaced submarines at night or in poor visibility, appearing without warning to attack before U-boats could dive to safety. The installation of powerful searchlights on anti-submarine aircraft enabled devastating night attacks, with the lee light illuminating surprised U-boats in the final seconds before weapons release. Statistics revealed the aircraft's impact starkly. By 1944, aircraft were responsible for a larger proportion of U-boat kills than surface vessels, and the mere possibility of air attack forced submarines to remain submerged during daylight hours, drastically reducing their effective patrol range and attack opportunities. As we examine the tactics that nearly won the Battle of the Atlantic, we must acknowledge that Germany's failure stemmed not from any single decisive defeat, but from the cumulative weight of multiple factors working against the U-boat arm. Insufficient numbers of submarines at war's beginning meant Germany never achieved the concentration of force that Dönitz believed necessary for decisive victory. The breaking of Enigma codes compromised German operations at their most fundamental level, allowing convoys to avoid wolf packs and enabling Allied forces to ambush U-boats whose positions were known through decrypted communications. Allied industrial capacity, particularly American shipbuilding, eventually overwhelmed German sinking rates through sheer productive volume. Technological advances in detection and weapons progressively eroded the U-boat's tactical advantages until the hunter became the hunted. Strategic decisions, diverting U-boats to Mediterranean and Arctic operations rather than concentrating them in the decisive North Atlantic theater, delaying development of advanced submarine types like the Type 21, failing to prioritize anti-radar and snorkel technologies earlier in the war, all contributed to the campaign's ultimate failure. Yet despite these disadvantages and mistakes, the U-boat force came perilously close to success during multiple periods, particularly in 1942, when merchant ship losses exceeded replacement rates and Britain's import situation approached catastrophic levels. The margin between failure and success measured narrower than post-war accounts sometimes suggest, and, under slightly different circumstances, more submarines available earlier, Type 21 deployment in 1943 instead of 1945, sustained focus on North Atlantic convoy routes rather than dispersing forces to secondary theaters, Germany's underwater warriors might indeed have strangled Britain into submission and fundamentally altered the war's trajectory. That they ultimately failed should not diminish recognition of how close they came to achieving what many considered impossible, bringing history's greatest maritime power to its knees through the systematic destruction of its merchant fleet by a relative handful of submarines operating from a position of overall naval inferiority.